Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, a nature and wildlife photographer based in Northern California. And I'm out here photographing birds in a very gloomy day with the Sony A1 and the 300mm GM, the A1 Mark II. And I wanted to make a video today where I talk about some of the things I miss about Canon and Nikon. And it's inspired by a lot of the comments out there I'm seeing that are just sort of eviscerating people who shoot other brands. There's a lot of criticism, a lot of negativity, a lot of brand loyalty. And I don't really have a brand loyalty. I've used Canon, Nikon, and Sony over the past decade. These are all fantastic brands, and there's pros and cons to all of them. And we shouldn't, perhaps, be so aggressively negative towards each other when someone else shoots another brand, and we might disagree with their conclusion about the brand that we're shooting. So first, let's talk about Nikon. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is the camera bodies. I missed the Z8 and the D850 before that. I've owned both of those cameras. I really miss the feel in the hand. The ergonomics, it just feels like a very refined, sturdy, well-built camera, but also just feels really good in the hand. It's a 4-finger grip, both of those bodies, so your hand is entirely sort of fitting like a glove around the camera. There's also a stickiness of rubber or something like that that they put into the grip that just, I don't know, it feels really good in the hand. And I definitely think about that a lot and notice that when I'm just using the Sony A1 Mark II. The A1 Mark II is an incredible camera. It's much more comfortable than the A7R5 before that, which I owned, and the A7R3, which I owned in an infrared camera. Those are both really inferior, less so for the A7R5, but the A1 Mark II is really great compared to Sony cameras. It's not as good in the hand as the Z8 is. Another thing that I have been realizing in the field with the A1 Mark II compared to the Nikon cameras, the Z8 has a lot of features that make it very useful and easy to use at night. And I've been doing more and more Milky Way photography and night photography. And in particular, the Z8 has two features that I miss. One feature is that starlight autofocus, I believe is what it's called, and it expands the autofocus capabilities of the Z8 at night by slowing down the autofocus. And I realized it's doing something very similar to a smart telescope that I have, which is very much slowing down autofocus, passing by the star focus, and then coming back to it. It's a very similar autofocus mechanism to a telescope, and it's really useful at night. So I miss that feature. The A1 Mark II is okay, but it's not at the same level as the Z8 for focusing on stars. Another thing at night that I've realized I really miss is the illumination of controls on the Nikon camera bodies. On Sony, I've been forced to look into the EVF or the back panel, and it blows out your night vision immediately. Those are very bright LCD screens, and it's very bright. And it ruins your feeling of being in the moment and also your ability to see. So the Z8 and other Nikon bodies have illuminated controls, and they also have a top panel that allows you to see what your settings are without going into the EVF or the back panel. And I really have been missing that in the field. I've been fumbling around with an iPhone flashlight or a headlamp when I really don't want to be. Another thing I miss about Nikon is the colors. Now, I don't think people talk a lot about Nikon color science, if we want to call it science. You know, there is something to be said about you can grade anything, you can edit your raw files in any program, yada, yada, yada. But Nikon colors are really great for landscape and nature scenes. The greens are vibrant and punchy. They have a little bit of yellow in them. They look great. And they are really nice files, the NEF files, to just edit easily and quickly for a realistic, punchy landscape or wildlife photo. I miss that. It was so easy to edit those files for me. I just grew up in photography editing those files. So I miss just the ease of which I could edit those files. I find like I'm working with the Sony files a lot. Something else about Nikon that's pretty special is their image stabilization, their vibration reduction VR technology. I didn't really appreciate it at the time, but Nikon is incredible at stabilizing footage handheld. I would hold the Nikon 600mm PF in one arm up to my eye and be able to get a shot below 1/100th of a second. The stabilization is fantastic. And it goes on pretty much all of their Z glass. There's a 600, the 400 f4.5. Even when I adapted a Canon EF 500mm IS Mark II lens to Nikon, it worked great. So it's just something that you've got some sorcery going on there, but their image stabilization is incredible. And particularly comparing that to Sony, it's honestly night and day. Now, finally, you can't really talk about Nikon without talking about their glass. And Nikon lenses are pretty special. And one of the reasons why I switched to Sony was because of the availability of third-party lenses like Sigma 50mm 1.2 that I use for portrait photography, Viltrox lenses, and the Sigma 20mm f1.4 that I use for astrophotography. These are not available on other manufacturer platforms, particularly Nikon or Canon. But when it comes to Nikon, there is something very special about their wildlife glass in particular. And I really do miss having a PF, which is their Fresnel lenses options, which are very lightweight telephoto lenses that are very sharp primes. So the 600mm PF I owned, absolutely love that lens and I miss it. And I always wanted to try the 800mm PF for small bird photography. And when it comes to Sony, there really is no viable way to get to 800mm that offers you a sharp, lightweight option. You have the 400 to 800, which is an FA to 800, which is fine, but it's heavy. And unfortunately, I tried a copy and it was really, really bad. And I think there's a lot of copy variation with that lens, and Sony has some work to do on that front. So other than that, you can put a 1.4x teleconverter on the 200 to 600, but it's not as great as having a prime. So you just don't have those telephoto lightweight options on Sony. That's why I'm shooting the 300 f2.8, because it's kind of the only way for me to get a lightweight option to get out there to 600mm or 400mm. Also, there's one landscape lens that I really miss as well, and that is the 24 to 120 f4. No one else makes that lens. I owned it on F mount and I owned it on Z mount, and I miss it. It's a perfect landscape lens, particularly if you couple that with something like a 100 to 400. All right, we've turned around and we're heading back, so it's time for Canon. So with Canon, I miss the same thing I miss with Nikon, which is the body and the controls. They're different than Nikon, but I still miss them all the same. Sony actually has kind of copied the Canon layout here. They have, you can see a wheel, I don't know if you can see it here, on the bottom, on the center here. And that wheel functions very similarly to the Canon wheel. The difference is it's just much smaller, and it's just a different experience. Also with Canon, I like that top panel and the ability to see your settings. It's just nice to have. It's not something that we get on Sony. Instead, we get more customizable buttons. The next thing I really miss about Canon is a particular lens, and that lens is the RF 100 to 500. Now, when this lens came out, it was divisive. Some people loved it, some people hated it. There's a lot of talk about that maximum aperture of f7.1 at 500 millimeters, what that would do to bokeh, what that would do to obviously low light photography. But I have to say, I own that lens, and the second I sold that lens, I had regret. I miss it. For me, that lens is a 100 to 400 that's been given steroids. It's so good for wildlife and for nature and landscape photography. Next thing I wanted to mention about Canon is the colors. Now, Canon color science, the alliteration there, became a bit of a thing about a decade ago, and a lot of people talk about it. I don't know that there's that much science behind any of this stuff. I do think that their colors are warm, very easy to use, very good for mammals. Red foxes, for example, look fantastic. So it's just a little bit of a easier color system to use and to edit than Sony, in my experience. Finally, I wanted to talk about autofocus on Canon. I think Canon autofocus is fantastic. I don't know if it's as good or better or worse or whatever than Sony, but it is definitely in the same league, and they are really good at different things. They're both better than Nikon though. So when it comes to Sony autofocus, I think the cameras pick up and track subjects very, very well, whether they're an inanimate object, like something that you want to track like a ball or something like that, or whether it's a human. I guess an inanimate object would mean it's not moving, right? So it couldn't be a ball. But anyway, Sony allows you to just put the tracking box on whatever you want and just track it. And it works very, very well. And I have really no problems with that. I think it's probably easiest to use from that functionality. But Canon's configuration and their ability to just work in wide area, as it's called in Sony world, but basically the entire focus area, I think Canon's pretty much unmatched. And with Sony, it's almost unusable to use wide unless it's a bright sky and you're shooting a subject against the bright sky and it's the only thing in the image. Otherwise, you're really just having to use smaller points to pick up your subject, and then the system will track it really well. Canon, I missed that. I missed that I could just have two easy buttons. One button and back button was the entire area, autofocus subject detection, just finding a subject and focusing on it. And the second button was an override, which was a single point. It was simple, easy to use, worked vast majority of the times, and I could just focus on the experience of photography. And I miss that. Sony, I am always thinking about and tweaking settings and just a little bit overwhelmed by the customizability and also the need to customize the camera settings when it comes to autofocus. Canon just works, and I miss that because not just is it easier, it's not just because I'm a dope and it's an easier thing to use, it's also because it's just more fun. Like, I don't want to be thinking about autofocus settings when I'm in the field. I want to just be experiencing it and focusing on composition and trying to get the shot right. Canon is the universal donor of old glass, and I'll talk about, but Nikon's the universal acceptor. So this has to do with flange distance and the ability to adapt lenses. It's not just that, it's also the electronics and the way the camera bodies work with old lenses. But Canon EF glass adapts extremely well to Canon RF mount cameras, but also to Nikon, Sony, OM, Fuji, and other manufacturer camera bodies. That old EF glass is a super bargain. And I actually had the EF 300 millimeter f 2.8. I had the Canon 500 millimeter f4 IS Mark II lenses, and they were awesome, super good lenses, even though they were a decade old, much less expensive than the equivalent RF mount glass, though there actually is no equivalent to the 500 f4 really. And they just were super bargains and really great camera equipment. And I wish I kept them. I sold that 500 because I made $1,000 on the sale and I used it to finance other equipment. But the point is that EF mount glass is just so useful for adapting to your RF mount bodies, and the technology of those adapters, the EF to RF mount adapter works really well, much better than the Nikon F to Z mount adapter. So highly recommend using EF glass, and it is a real asset to the RF system. I mentioned that Nikon would be the Z mount universal acceptor, and that's because Nikon can accept, the Z mount cameras can accept glass from pretty much any manufacturer on the other end, and particularly notably Canon EF mount glass and Sony glass can adapt really well to Nikon. So if you are shooting two different systems, these facts and differences are really worth acknowledging. But I miss that EF mount glass. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video about Canon and Nikon and things that I miss. I do want to say I think Sony is a great option for a lot of reasons, and I don't want to suggest that it isn't. It tracks incredibly well, the best of any of the systems, particularly in complicated environments. I feel like the Sony tracking autofocus is just in a league of its own when it comes to tracking wildlife subjects. And also the portrait primes in particular come to mind as an area where Sony just has so many options that are lightweight, sharp, and really exceptional. I think all the brands have benefits and, cons, and I think we all just need to be real about that. And just to say, let's be positive in the comments section and in YouTube and in the forums in general. That's what inspired this video in the first place, which is that there's a lot of negativity out there. And I think what's happening here, and I'll just use brands as examples because I want to illustrate the point. But, what'll happen is like somebody who bought Nikon will hear someone else talking about how Canon's really great. And they'll put the person down who got Canon. They'll say that they made the wrong decision. They'll say that person's terrible and they don't know what they're doing because Nikon's so much better and yada, yada, yada. And the thing is, what's happening there is the person who bought Nikon spent a lot of money on their gear and they want to justify that purchase and feel good about it. And so they put down the person who got Canon and said the Canon equipment was better because they want to feel good about themselves. And I just think we have to be real that that's what's happening. We're like doing this brand loyalty thing for these companies. We're advertising for them. We're, just advancing their interests while criticizing each other and being negative. And I don't think that's a very good way to use the internet. So let's do better and be nice to each other and be positive, because photography should be about experiencing the world, documenting it, and bringing joy and emotions to people through our art. And I think it should be about that and not brands. So be well, take care. Don't forget to get outside and enjoy your Thanksgiving breaks. Bye.